Hello, this is Chef John from foodwishes.com with Farro with wild mushrooms. That's right, I'm going to show you a little modern side dish magic with a very ancient grain. And I mean ancient. All right, if you wanted to tweet about this when it first came out, you would have had to chisel it into a piece of stone, which is so much harder. Although you wouldn't have had a character limit. But anyway, this very, very old grain is easy to prepare, nutritious, and very delicious. So let me show you how to put this together. And first up, we're going to take care of our wild mushrooms. And for this, I'm going to use some dried porcini. And you know it's going to be expensive when you see script on the label. And priced by the pound, this is very expensive. But the good news is you only need a tiny, tiny amount. And all we need to do to prep this is soak it in some warm water for about 20-30 minutes until it's soft enough to dice up. So we'll just put that in some warm water and we'll set that aside until needed. And at that point, we can move on to our non-wild mushrooms. So we're also going to use a little bit of fresh mushroom here. So I have some brown cremini mushrooms. And before we cut them, I am going to take off the stem. I just think it looks a little nicer. Those tend to be a little more fibrous, but mostly it's just aesthetics. And what we want to do here is just cube these up. And to do that, all you have to do is slice it 3 or 4 times this way, and then turn, and then slice it 3 or 4 times that way. And if you do that, you're going to have some nicely uniform pieces of mushroom. Check it out. I don't think people realize that good knife skills have more to do with geometry than they do hand-eye coordination. It's true. And then once those are cut, let's head over to the stove. And we'll put a pan on medium-high heat with a little bit of olive oil in it. And we'll toss in our mushrooms along with a big pinch of salt. And what we want to do is cook these until they have a little bit of color on them. And you know the deal with mushrooms in these kind of recipes. First we make them wet, then we make them dry, then we make them wet. So first that salt's going to draw moisture out of the mushroom. It's going to get all kind of wet and slimy. But that's okay, because that moisture will evaporate. And they will start to saute in that oil. And pretty soon you'll have something that looks like this. And of course, sauteing them like this is what really brings out that meaty, mushroomy flavor. All right, so you're going to want to cook yours at least this far. And at this point, we can go ahead and add our dried porcini, which hopefully are no longer dry. So we'll fish those out of our water. Mine were in there about 20 minutes. And at this point, they should be soft enough to give a rough chop to. And if they're not, let them go a little longer. But anyway, we're going to give those a chop. And we'll toss those in with our fresh mushrooms. And we'll saute that for a few minutes to kind of take a little bit of that wetness out of the mushroom. And I believe our heat's still on medium-high, but if you want to back it down a little bit towards medium, that's probably not a bad idea. So like I said, we'll dump in the porcini. We'll cook that with our regular mushrooms for a couple minutes, at which point we're going to add a half a diced onion, and we will stir that in, and we will saute that for, 5 or 6 minutes, until those onions turn translucent and kind of get a little bit golden. And they should look something like this, at which point we will add some minced garlic, and we'll stir that in. And as usual, we're only going to cook that for about a minute. Please do not brown your garlic. Although there is a lot of moisture in that pan, so that's probably not going to happen, but just be careful. And once we've given that garlic a little quick sizzle, we can add the star of the show, the farro, a beautiful and, like I said, very ancient grain. And please make sure you're getting what's called pearled farro. And I'll explain that on the blog, but that's what you're going to need for this recipe. And of course, you've done this ahead of time, but what we want to do before we add this to the pan is I like to give it a rinse in cold water. This brand I'm using came from Tuscany, so we'll give it a quick wash just in case there's any Tuscan dust. Then we'll let that drain, and we'll go ahead and dump that into our pan, because before we introduce any liquid here, I want to make sure all those grains are coated with olive oil. Kind of similar to a risotto technique, which this recipe is loosely based on. So stir that around until your farro's completely coated, at which point we're going to add just 1 cup of chicken broth. And what we want to do is raise our heat up to high to bring this up to a simmer. I'm also going to add a nice big pinch of salt here. And then here's the plan. As soon as that starts simmering, we're going to back the heat down to medium-low. We're going to cover it, and we're going to cook that covered until all that broth has been absorbed, which is probably going to take about 10 minutes. And what we should do is give it a stir about halfway through. So I'm going to take off the lid, give it a stir. All right, even it back out. We'll put the lid back on and cook it until, like I said, all that broth has been absorbed. At which point it should look something like this. And then once that's happened, we'll add the rest of the broth, which is a couple cups, and we'll stir that in. And then we're basically going to sort of repeat the process. We'll raise our heat up to high until it starts to simmer. All right, we'll give it a stir. And then once again, we'll back our heat down to medium-low. We'll cover that, and we will cook it covered on medium-low for 15 minutes. And just like before, we'll take off the lid once in a while and give it a stir. And you can see those grains are starting to swell up a little bit. They're starting to absorb that stock. So we'll put the lid back on. And like I said, we're going to go for 15 minutes. And at that point, it should look something like this. All right, your mixture should still be fairly wet. And at this point, your farro should just start to be getting tender. It won't be there yet, but for the rest of the cooking process, we're going to leave the lid off, and we're just going to keep cooking and stirring until we've reached our desired doneness. And this is the part of the recipe we call the adjustment phase. If your grain is already cooked and the mixture has too much moisture, turn up the heat and dry it up a little bit. Conversely, if your farro is still too firm and the mixture is getting too dry, add another splash of broth or stock. That is you cooking. So I let mine go for a few more minutes until it looked like this, which for me was absolutely perfect. Not too dry, not too wet. Those grains of farro are tender but have a little bit of chewiness to them. And of course, just like if you're doing a pasta or rice side dish, you're the one that has to decide how far to cook this. Like I said, I like mine tender, but with a little bit of chewiness to it. Other people like theirs very firm, other people like theirs very soft. So that is completely up to you. But once we have decided it's just right, let's turn our heat all the way down to low and move to final production, which for me is stirring in a little bit of creme fraiche. As you know, creme fraiche is a fermented cream, so it's going to provide a little acidity, a little tanginess, which I think works really nice here. So we'll stir that in. We can also do our final seasoning at this point. So I'm going to add a little more salt, as well as some freshly ground black pepper. And then we're also going to put in some fresh herb. I'm going to use some Italian parsley. And as soon as that's stirred in, we can turn off our heat because we're pretty much done. And right here you can see the final product. Just a gorgeous, gorgeous grain. And at this point, with the heat off, you're ready to serve up. Although one optional step, which I enjoy, I'm going to grate in a little bit of Parmigiano Reggiano. I think it's a nice touch, but again, that's up to you. You are the Nero of your farro. So I'm going to stir that in, and then transfer that into some kind of attractive, preferably Tuscan dish. And then because I already had it out, I garnished with a little extra cheese and parsley. And our farro with wild mushrooms is done. And for a humble grain-based side dish, looks pretty impressive. So let's go ahead and dig in. And if you've never had farro before, you're in for a treat. It just has a very mild, earthy, nutty flavor, sort of similar to a barley. And I just love the texture. Like I said earlier, it's tender, but it has this great chewiness to it that's kind of addictive. It just makes for such an interesting change of pace from those other more common starchy side dishes. But anyway, that's it. Farro with wild mushrooms. Sometimes the best new things are the best old things. So if you've not tried this delicious, nutritious, and very easy to make grain, I really hope you give it a try soon. All right? So head over to foodwishes.com for all the ingredient amounts and more info as usual. And as always, enjoy.